Hi everybody, this is Maya Poet. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have for you the second part of my interview with Soren, who if you've watched part one, and I think that before watching part two you absolutely should watch part one, you will see someone who has a harrowing story of not only sort of psychological distress that was medicalized and turned into iatrogenic harm, but also somebody who's incredibly intelligent, insightful, and inspiring. Today in this episode, we will be talking about how Soren went from being trans-identified to going down the process of desistance and detransition, as well as sharing some elements of how my story of desistance were really intertwined with hearing Soren's story in a video. So, Soren, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm glad. It's good to have you. So I guess I would just like to start by asking you a little bit about, like, after being trans-identified and after going through testosterone and your sort of near-death experience with the double mastectomy and the poor care that you received around that, how did you go from all of that, sort of all of those different arcs in your story, to eventually detransitioning? Like, was there a singular moment that you realized that you didn't want to do this anymore? Was it an ideological shift? Like, can you tell us a little about that?
So, it was a little bit of everything. And I know, wow, that everything is such a big concept, right? But it really was. I like to think that what led me to transition was a complex set of issues, and therefore the solution to that problem was similarly complex. I do think that there was a moment where the switch flipped in my head, but you need a little bit of context to understand what that moment truly meant for me. So, starting from when I had my mastectomy, that's a huge source of medical trauma. That alone, I do not think would have influenced me to detransition. Like, it was rather harrowing, yes, but I was very hopeful, and I was able to kind of spin it into something positive, something that I could do to empower my fellow trans people against these awful doctors who are trying to practice trans medicine in bad faith, right? I thought it was just the Crane Clinic that was doing this. However, and this is one piece of the larger puzzle, I realized they were not. I realized they were actually one of many, that there was a money problem. A friend has since pointed out to me that if you go to the Crane Clinic website, that one of the first things you'll notice is this huge pay now button. Like, the money is front and center in their marketing. But aside from that, aside from following the money and knowing that the Crane Clinic itself was one of many who were taking advantage of this psychological issue and turning it into a physical, very profitable market, if you will, I also, at the time, was starting to really dig into my higher education. I was a COVID 2020 graduate, so I didn't get my entrance into college, into higher ed, was not full of many bells and whistles because everything was shut down. In fact, 4 years into my college education, I still have not had a full semester in person. This next semester will actually be my first semester fully in person, and I'm in year 5. So, but as I began to dig into my education, I took a sociology class, I took a biological anthropology class, I took a cultural anthropology class, and I learned to understand human beings through our lens of socialization, and more importantly, through our lens of socialization as apes, as a species of ape. And so, understanding that we don't arrive to who we are and our understanding of ourselves in a vacuum, I realized that my childhood had a greater impact on my conceptualization of self today than I had previously realized. Knowing that, I realized that my difficulty socializing was likely something that I could fix. And not fix in the sense that I expected perfection, but fix in the sense that if I wanted to obtain certain things in life, I wanted to be able to do certain things that I thought had been previously forbidden to me, such as making eye contact, right? Like these things I could essentially go back and re-socialize myself to do. And as I did this, I learned that my discomfort with womanhood was likely similar to my discomfort with eye contact, for example, that I had had a misinterpretation of what it was. Like for the longest time, I thought that eye contact was this thing that people found comfortable inherently, and not this thing that people use as a symbol to show that they're friendly, that it's like it's a disalarming thing. Like it's something that is supposed to make you feel comfortable with an individual. And similarly, you know, there is a womanhood culturally speaking, but it was a misunderstanding of mine to think that it was something inherent, that cultural aspect, that rather the biological aspect being inherent, that the set of norms such as dress and behavior, that was inherent. And it is in some ways, and this is something I've grown into that I was not quite aware of at the time of my detransition. I've since come to understand that the behavioral things do have an evolutionary component and are therefore very tangible. Like women being more permissible is like an evolutionary thing because we don't necessarily have the same prowess as many men do. It is good for us to be able to bow down sometimes so we don't get like beaten to death. But that said, just because you're outside the norm does not make you part of the thing to which the norm belongs. You know, so I mean, that's just one component of it. There's so much more, like getting to know my family better, thinking of the young women in my life and what kind of womanhood I was constructing for them. And ultimately, and this is the part that I don't share as freely because it's more embarrassing. Leading up to my detransition, I had been involved involved very loosely with a sort of detrans fetish online. Particularly on the platform Tumblr, there was, I don't know how many, but there was a good mass of trans men, female to male people who would role play with lesbians, with TERFs on Tumblr, being forcibly detransitioned, interacting with womanhood and the norms of womanhood as a role one could step into for sexual pleasure. And a lot of it was playing with misogyny. There was a moment where the line between the porn and the real activism began to be blurred. And I came across a post by a self-identified TERF explaining what she felt womanhood to be. That she felt, you know, conservatives said woman equals this, and trans activists said this equals woman, whereas TERFs were just trying to say woman is woman and that's it. Like there's nothing more to it other than being female. And I had this moment of clarity literally in the middle of doing something that, you know, one is typically not very clear in. And that is the moment where the switch flipped, where I was just in this vulnerable position, you know, half dressed, just thinking like, wow, these individuals who I thought were just bigoted, who I needed to just block out, actually had some semblance of truth behind their words. And from there, I mean, I really couldn't ignore it. Like, why was I getting off to this thing? And it was because, again, it was something that I wouldn't allow myself to really digest in any other part of life. So long-winded, but it was a very long-winded conclusion. It took me a long time to get to that point.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I mean, I've never heard anybody talk about this before, and I wonder if it's more common of a story than one may think as to like an origin of a detransition. Although, I mean, for you, there were a lot of things going on. Obviously, like you said before, the medical trauma, the medical harm, and then this content that you were exposed to online, on Tumblr of all places, which is an online site that I hear a lot of both trans-identified people and detransitioners talking about.
Oh, yeah.
As like the source of like where they came to the conclusion that they are transgender or that they're non-binary or that they were born in the wrong body.
And it did play a role for me in that side of the transition as well. Like, yes, it played a role in my detransition, but I very much got integrated into the more fantastical sides of trans identity through websites like Tumblr.
Wow. It's really interesting that, in a way, like there was this underlying distress in your life that we talked about in the part one of this. And, I mean, you had sort of upheaval in your family and like just a lot of different types of discomfort also surrounding puberty, and that, like, as it happens in many cases with a lot of these people who, you know, a lot of these kids who start identifying as trans in their early adolescent years or their pre-adolescent years, is basically just that they have a bunch of underlying distress, and they spend a lot of time online. They're angsty teenagers. They don't have as many in real life friendships as kids who grew up, for example, 20 years before we did had. And as a result, you know, and a lot of them are highly creative, and they go onto like these fandom sites, these cosplaying sort of subcultures.
Oh yeah, I was really into cosplay.
Right.
Like really into cosplay.
Yeah, and so they have distress, and they have, you know, these creative skills that they want, and loneliness, and they need an outlet for all of those things. They'll go onto a site like Tumblr back in our day, or like TikTok for the kids growing up these days.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that they come across this idea, this all-encompassing framework, which is quite similar to a horoscope, in that it offers like extremely general criteria for what makes somebody transgender. And this criteria can be applicable to basically every single teenage girl there is.
Oh yeah, and I would argue that as teenage girls reach puberty, that is especially true. Like this time of discomfort with one's body, this rapid changing one's body, like it's something that I think many young women and girls would want to escape and would escape from if given the option. It's interesting that you mentioned the element of socialization there, because that was the point I had made about sort of re-socializing myself. I think COVID, something I've noticed was that COVID was actually sort of a gateway for a lot of people to begin identifying as trans. And for myself, it was the time at which I started the medicalization, right? But as I think life began to reopen post-COVID, like think 2021, which is when 2021 to 2022, which is when I detransitioned, I felt like there was almost this more level playing field, because so many people had their socialization harmed by the lockdowns, that whenever we all kind of came back together, I was able to integrate into society more smoothly than previously, where I felt like people had a little bit of an edge on me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make total sense. I mean, there's definitely an element of socialization in all of this, and I think about all of the teenagers who were growing up in COVID, and how difficult that must have been, especially for the teenagers who were maybe just starting, like they were going into their last year of middle school or first year of high school when the lockdowns started happening, and how absolutely detrimental that must have been to their social development and their psychological development. And just spending all your time online at that point.
Oh yeah.
Being surrounded by all of this discourse and the heightened threats that kids face every day on the internet just became exponentially worse and more threatening and more even existentially dangerous.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have this sort of feedback from a real life friend group. All of their social interactions, whether it was school or whether it was, you know, just after school, like they spent their school and after school behind the same desk and on the same computer. That was their entire life. So it makes perfect sense. And also, I think COVID was just collectively traumatizing.
Oh, it was. It totally was. And mentioning, you know, that continuity of location when it comes to putting on these different hats. Like my hats as someone who is interacting on social media, and my hat as a scholar, for example. Like, I was going to online school before it was COVID cool. I graduated from an online high school, started in 2018, so 2 years prior to the onset of COVID. And I know that it's a very normal aspect in the development of oneself, taking on the role of other people. I think I actually may have mentioned it in a previous video too, and it's a quite common concept in the field of sociology, etc. But when it comes to having these different spaces for you to take on these different roles in, like think when you're playing baseball, you're taking on the role of the first baseman. When you're in school, you're taking on the role of the jock. When you are at home, you're taking on the role of son, you know. All of these different roles, it's actually very healthy to have these different aspects of self. But you look now post-COVID, when all those kind of got blurred together, and you see so many kids popping off with dissociative identity disorder and just disorders of the self, more now than ever before, I would argue. And it's just very interesting, because that was actually something too that led to my critical perspective on gender. Was I was a huge Facebook person. Like, I was hugely into Facebook. I was a part of thousands of Facebook groups. It was actually awful. And there was
That's surprising for your generation.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
you're a few years younger than me.
A lot of the people I was interacting with were like millennials, but on Facebook there's a culture within these Facebook groups that is almost cult-like. And in these Facebook groups, we debated identity, we debated social issues, we debated political issues. It was rather good in some ways because I got to interact in an intellectual space with people who were also similarly awkward. I mean, they're socializing over Facebook. Like, I didn't have the same judgment as I did in real life. But that said, there was groups I was in where people were vitriolic, and I was a lurker, so I was just watching all of this unfold. But there was groups I was in where people were making fun of, and also as part of the making fun of, critiquing the identities of people who were listing out their disorders like some sort of shopping list. That they could pick and choose acronyms from to create this marketable self online. Because that's something I think about too, is like when you go on your social media page, you have like 200 characters to type out your bio. And I'm sorry, my life is more complex than 200 characters, right? And so you have people like, how can I condense myself into this thing that people want to follow, that people want to interact with? You know, what can I say to make them think like, oh, that person's interesting? And now you go viral for sharing a glimpse into your life when your life says, you know, life, for example, has 10 people within one person, like in the case of DID, which has its own history we could go into. It's a very iatrogenic thing, but that's an interesting thing I think that COVID made worse, was like those groups became the primary center of socialization. It was no longer something that was sort of niche, that was like relegated to those of us who are socially awkward. Like, it became something that your average person began to interact with. So very interesting indeed.
Yeah, no, that's pretty fascinating. Like, what all of this made me think of is, like, you talked about a little bit how trans played into, you know, the overlap with COVID.
Yeah.
Like, basically how we talked about it also, not just in your case, but in the case of these other teenagers. And I started to think back to my COVID experience, and I was in Israel during COVID, and I was fighting the bureaucracy to becoming an Israeli citizen. And in May of 2021, that was actually the time that I experienced my first war in Israel.
Wow.
And for me, like, it was more so the experience of that war than just the overall, like, lockdowns that made me sort of reconsider this trajectory. Although, I wouldn't even say that I started to reconsider it back in 2021. It's just that once I lived through this war and I was running in and out of bomb shelters, and I noticed my, like, lefty American friends basically saying that Israelis should have to, you know, live under rocket fire and be subject to terrorists. And I realized that basically all of these lefties just didn't have enough information to be making the kind of claims that they were making, because they didn't realize that they were supporting a terrorist group that also, in addition to wanting to wipe every Jew off the face of the map, also is willing to and celebratory of the killing of as many Palestinians who they use as human shields as is humanly possible in order to achieve their goal of wiping out all of the Jews from Israel and then moving on and making their way throughout the West and establishing an Islamic caliphate. So, like, I knew that there's something that Western listeners and viewers just don't know about this conflict, and I basically came to the conclusion that, like, I used to be where these friends of mine were before I moved to Israel. So if I just give them, like, good information that basically shows them that they're supporting a terrorist group that is doing all these awful things, maybe they would reconsider their position. So I went on the internet and I started to search, like, more pro-Israel media from really, like, credible sources in order to give them a more well-rounded picture of this issue that was thousands of miles away from them, that they were talking about nonstop. And I crafted my arguments, I would say, in a pretty decent way, considering I'd had years of debate training and rhetorical training. And my arguments actually did not convince a single one of my lefty American friends that maybe they should stop supporting a terrorist group, even if they don't care about the Jews, which is pretty obvious that they don't. For the sake of the Palestinians, they shouldn't be supporting Hamas, you know, because when your military force is a force that shoots rockets, a quarter of which fall short in Gaza and kill your own civilians, like, that alone should be a reason to not support Hamas. But anyways, like, when I was seeing the fact that all of my arguments were just bouncing right off of them, and that none of them were considering any other arguments, I became extremely disillusioned with the left, because I knew all of these kids, or these, at the time, young adults from debate. We did high school debate together. And these are people who I had debated in practice rounds, whose intelligence I admired, whose sort of grasp of rhetoric and reasoning I admired, who I thought were capable of navigating cognitive dissonance, similarly to how I had, navigated cognitive dissonance at different points in my life that caused me to go from like a pro-Palestinian campus activist to an Israeli citizen.
And so, like, were they able to offer a legitimate rebuttal, or did they just not receive it? Like, how did they respond to that? Because you said they didn't take it, like they didn't change their mind, but what did that look like?
So they would mostly a bunch of ad hominem attacks, character attacks. They would say that I'm a colonizer, a settler sympathizer, things of that nature. Just no actual refutation, no attempt to refute. And I was debating with these jerks while I was running in and out of bomb shelters. Like, keep in mind, I was running, I'd hear a siren, run to a bomb shelter, stay in the bomb shelter, there's no Wi-Fi, wait for the siren to be over, wait a few additional minutes as per the protocol, go back to the apartment that I was staying in, go on the internet, and I would, see this type of stuff playing out on my feed. So that was one major shift in me becoming disillusioned with the left as a whole, or really the start of myself becoming disillusioned with the left. But the second major part of it is that in the process of trying to search for, credible, like, pro-Israel media, basically media that the best type of media that critiques everything that is wrong with Hamas, is that the algorithms had suggested me more content that was in line with the basket of acceptable ideas to which the pro-Israel position belonged, which was on the right wing. So I started to get content relating to, like, the Black Lives Matter protests in the in response to George Floyd, and all kinds of different issues. And one of the issues that was covered as part of the right wing on the culture wars was the critique of gender ideology.
Yeah. So
that's really how I started to get into it. And I think it's interesting because, like, it's, both in the case of COVID as an overwhelming phenomenon, but also in these type of traumas, which really end up being catalysts, it seems both in the case of what drives a teenager into trans identification, but also what might drive that same teenager as a young adult out of trans identification, there does seem to be, like, underlying distress the entire time.
Oh, yeah.
Whether you've, with, like, little periods of euphoria, right? Like, you get your first binder and you're like, oh, amazing, like, I've solved that problem. But then you wear the binder and then, your back starts to hurt more and more and more the longer you wear it. But the pain creeps up on you so slowly that you don't even realize it.
Yeah.
Like, I often liken binding to a sweet poison, for that exact reason. Similarly to, like, antifreeze. Like, antifreeze until the early 2000s used to have a sweet aftertaste, but because so many, like, wives were poisoning their husbands with it by putting it in, like, chocolate milk and stuff like that, the company had to, change the chemical compound in order to add a bitter taste so that people would realize that, hey, there's something off with my chocolate milk, and stop drinking it. The safeguard, really, in the example of, like, the antifreeze, was the adding of that bitter taste. But in the case of binding, it's that little bitter aftertaste is something that, like, you only realize that you've been slowly poisoning yourself with this practice of binding, for example, over a long period of time. And most importantly, once you take the binder off. Like, I noticed that for me, taking the binder off in the process of desistance made me realize, like, how much harm 7 years of daily and sometimes nightly binding had been doing to my body over time.
Yeah.
And the reason that I go on this whole rant is because maybe that's something we should explore, like the ways in which overall, like, kind of background noise, and that the background noise of distress, whether it's puberty or whether it's the actual distress that comes along with the process of transitioning and of trying to, deceive everybody around you about what your biological sex is, or about trying to deceive your own eyes when you're looking in the mirror and trying to fight your nature in every possible way, in ways that require like a lot of thought. Like transition is not an easy process. It is something that requires you to basically fixate on your sexed body and your like secondary sex characteristics. So maybe that's something we should go into, is like, I guess the relationship between this background trauma that seems to drive people both into transition and out of transition, and the ways in which maybe certain specific traumatic catalysts end up really pushing you one way or the other. We could talk about that, or we could talk about like, I don't know, anything else, maybe binding or whatever. I guess whatever thoughts you have off of what I said, that's fine.
No, I have a lot of thoughts. I was trying to catalog them and keep them straight in my head while still listening to you, because what you said I think is really profound, that it is something that sneaks up on you. And a thought I'd had actually when you were talking about the antifreeze metaphor with binding was eventually it becomes so hard on your body that the solution then is to take a more extreme intervention, such as a mastectomy, because that was what happened with me. It was, I got sick of wearing a binder every day in Texas. Texas is so humid, it's so hot, it's so sticky, and to have this thing like pressing my chest against itself, it was very uncomfortable. But I think bigger than that, one thing that also really stuck with me was the disillusionment with leftism. Because for me, I know that when I first detransitioned, it wasn't because I was suddenly comfortable with womanhood. Actually, that moment where I had realized that woman was more than this image in my head, and that image in my head had been socialized, that moment where I had that realization and the moment in which I began to apply it to my everyday life was a little bit separate from one another. I eventually, despite my discomfort, realized that if I put up with the discomfort with the mindset of it being temporary, that eventually the discomfort would be something that I could integrate into myself and no longer experience. And so I put up with people calling me she and calling me miss and calling me ma'am and calling me a woman, not because it was something that gave me euphoria, not because it was this sickly, sweet poison that I was comfortable consuming, but because I knew that it was like a growing pain, that it was then something I could turn into its own. And the reason the leftism is applicable here is because I thought I had unlocked it. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, my leftist friends are going to love this. They're going to love the fact that, we can deprogram this sexist connotation of womanhood and manhood and reclaim it for ourselves. That I can make womanhood into this thing that I'm proud to pass down onto my sisters and my cousins and all these, little girls in my life. And what I found was that people were very unfriendly to it. I actually, one of the first podcasts that I ever did was with this gentleman who ran what he called an LGBTQ podcast, where he would just highlight different guests, right? A very simple concept. But when I went on with him and I shared my detransition, he was very fond of my story of, resilience after my complications with my mastectomy. But when I brought up the word detrans, his first words were like, oh, like the people who grift, like the people who go like around the country and like make money off of their sob stories. And I was like, well, actually, I don't think that really happens. And that it was this moment where I realized, I was like, whoa, like this idea of detransition that other people have is just so vastly different from mine. I can say, like, I'm not getting paid to do this. Like, I'm not getting paid. I'm not getting pressured into doing this. Like, I genuinely do this out of the desire to see a world better than the one that I grew up in. But, realizing that there was this sort of shutting down of dissent within the leftist spaces that I had revered for so long was something that made me realize that maybe leftism wasn't the space I thought it was. That it wasn't the space where you could have debates, like you were talking about those debate kids who you actually really respected, and you respected in the context of discourse. Like realizing that even the people that you trust, when the ideology becomes involved, it doesn't matter how intelligent they are. If they're not willing to receive it, they're not going to receive it. And that's why people wonder, like, why, well, if you're not a right-winger, like, why do you go on with people like Laura Ingraham or, Piers Morgan? And it's like, because those are the only people who will have me, A, and B, I see the merit in talking to everyone. And believe me, for every right-winger I have a conversation with in public, I'm having, conversations with 5 left-wingers behind the scenes. It's just that discourse isn't as publicly acceptable in those spaces. But I do find that when it doesn't, and this is maybe different than your experience, I'm not sure, I do find that most of the time when I have these conversations and I'm able to appeal it to one specific person, to not maybe come up with this generalized argument, but rather to try and get that person to empathize with me on a one-to-one basis, that they maybe are more open to it than they would be in Facebook or in a group or in a group chat. What's your experience with that been like?
Well, so I have not really, I guess, come out as detrans to very many of the, trans-identified people that I knew during the time that I was living as a guy. A few of them have found me and wished harm upon me, wishing that Hamas killed me. There was definitely a commenter like that who is somebody who I met in my previous life. And I mean, aside from that, I would say that there have been a couple trans-identified people who have come across, who've seen my videos just because the algorithm suggested it to me. There was one in particular who was really very understanding and who shared a lot of the same criticisms that I had, of the trans community and of the way in which, transition is presented as a cure-all for a variety of different forms of distress, and we're able to, have intelligent discussions about it. In general, though, I don't really, with the exception of a few people who are very close to me, who've known me but from before I transitioned, during transition, and now in this phase in my life, who've really been with me through it all and, supported the trans identity and all that. But mostly they did it just because they were supporting me.
Yeah,
but of course they weren't critical of anything because we were all like kids in the same developmental phase, I guess, of
I hear that.
being somewhat untethered from reality and engaging in fantastical thinking and wishful thinking. And those people, I think, have, are mostly worried about the type of speaking out that I'm doing now, more so than the actual, detransition. A lot of them will actually agree with me privately, but they'll say, yeah, there's no way I could even talk about this.
Yeah.
And there's always a little bit of resistance, because if somebody is unwilling to or incapable of listening to the arguments you present and is instead putting words in your mouth, and engaging in all kinds of logical fallacies. The biggest one I see in this specific area of life is, for example, when I will talk about the factors that drove me and a lot of other like neurodivergent and gender nonconforming children and teenagers into a trans identity. When I talk about those factors in an open and honest way, often what I get from people who buy into the claims of trans ideology is, well, I get two things. Usually one of them is, well, you were never truly trans.
I've heard that.
You're just gay, right? So that's one thing I get from them. And another one is that they'll basically go right to the most extreme and they'll say, oh, so do you then believe that transgenderism should be like outlawed? Like, do you hate trans people?
It's the black and white thinking.
It's the black and white thinking. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's like they're not, the as far as argumentation and debate goes, and this is a little like argumentation 101, if somebody's arguing with you, you want to give them the courtesy of picking their best and strongest arguments as they state them, and argue against their best and strongest arguments. You definitely can't just like, put an argument in their mouth that they didn't argue that is like ridiculous, and then argue against the ridiculous argument that they didn't make.
Yeah,
like,
you can't straw man it.
You can't. Like, that's just ridiculous. Like, don't do it. It's not good argumentation. And this is what I've seen from a lot of the people, in that area of my life. But like, were you getting at something more specific, or?
No, I think you answered it beautifully. I think you actually hit the nail on the head with a phenomenon that I've really grown to admire in college, which is listening to understand rather than to respond. I think Americans, especially Americans and Westerners, like the way that we interact with one another is in this very quick, fast-paced manner rather than a very thorough manner meant to enjoy and like savor. Does that make sense? Like to savor it versus to consume it. And therefore we are more interested in ourselves and rather than respecting the other person's argument, trying to push our own. And what you were talking about just now about like responding to a straw man, it's like you're responding to this misconception of what the person is saying that you had in your head rather than to what they actually are. And I think that interacting in a humble, like respectful manner actually requires you meeting them where they're at instead of where you thought they'd be. Which I think is very interesting too, because bringing this up, I'm interested also maybe to understand like how we end up with such a variety of responses to our stories, like people who maybe have stories very similar to our own, like other detransitioners and desisters who think that we're bigots for speaking out in the way that we do, how we somehow butt heads with them, yet have these other trans-identified people who come in with such a willingness to explore and to discourse. And I think that maybe a big difference there is like the willingness that people have with tolerating discomfort in themselves. Like I think sometimes people have an underlying acknowledgement of the contradiction of certain ideas and are willing to explore that instead of shunning it. Because I know that for me, like that kind of popped off in the example I gave earlier when I was exploring that sort of narrative of detransition porn, for lack of a better word, that I had this underlying desire to engage with womanhood as this thing that I wanted to have a good relationship with but couldn't have a good relationship with, that it was almost this object of desire rather than this thing that I could actually obtain. And so that was my way of engaging with that. But even like we were saying earlier, like that was private, just like how some of these conversations where you're agreeing with people is private. So how do we make that private thing, that thing that we have to kind of hold secret for lack of to avoid the rejection, like how do we take that private thing and make it more public? Because like that's what I think that we're really missing right now is that public. Because there's some organizations that do it, Braver Angels, Bridge USA. Like there are organizations that are trying to chip away at that polarization, but people either see them as wrongfully making space for devil's advocates, or they don't even know that they exist.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people who are in the going down the rabbit hole of like gender critical content will eventually, I mean, hope maybe this is an overstatement and like too much trust that I have in other people to engage in the type of sort of cognitive evolution that I did because I was so young. But still, like I was young enough to the point where I could have engaged in the type of cognitive weightlifting that was required in order for me to unindoctrinate myself from the ideas that I had indoctrinated myself into at the age of 12. So maybe I'm just assuming a lot here, but I think that for people who go, down the gender critical rabbit hole enough, they will start to spot all kinds of different contradictions, both within certain aspects of like gender critical discourse and obviously the blatant, disregard for any kind of like logical argumentation or evidence base that the trans ideology brigade sort of presents. I think that people will naturally sort of start to see all of these different arguments kicking around, watching one gender critical YouTuber and then watching a different gender critical YouTuber who has a different sort of flavor of their gender critical thought, and then watching, a super crazy trans activist who is
moderate one too.
Uh-huh.
Or then also comparing that to maybe more moderate ones,
right,
too.
that type of trans activist, comparing it to, like one of the old school transsexual types, or somebody who's of like the thought of like a true transsexual. And I think that people, once they get deep enough into it, they will start to be able to see how these different arguments, play out on like this, I guess, metaphorical battlefield, or maybe it's kind of like an ice hockey rink.
And it's also
of
like a
different
puzzle
ideas
too, where
it
it's
is like a puzzle.
putting together these pieces. I mean, and that's a piece of advice that I actually give quite often. I'm really glad you brought it up. Is like engaging with a diversity of viewpoint, like engaging with people with whom you disagree. Like I had an interview recently, and someone asked like, "What advice do you have for those listening?" And I knew it was a more conservative audience, and my piece of advice was like engage with trans people, engage with detrans people, engage with conservatives, engage with liberals, like engage with people with an open heart and an open mind. And it's not like if you are a person of conviction, you're going to be swayed to think totally radically different than you already do, but it does make your opinion more nuanced, because at the end of the day, if you're right, you now have more ammunition for being right in listening to these people who you might end up believing are wrong, but now you understand them better. Like, it's a radically good, I think, position to take, wanting to expand your worldview.
Oh, 100%. And to add to that, like, there is often something that happens in any kind of group that is bound together by a shared ideology, whether it's a religious ideology, like any organized religion, or whether it is a sort of decentralized type of ideological thinking as represented by gender ideology. There are inevitably schisms that happen. Like, I mean, even if you just look to the example of the Amish, they're an enclosed religious group, and different sects of Amish have broken up and been created over the question of, should the brim of a hat be 3 inches or should the brim of a hat be 3.5 inches? Right? So if people are willing to have schisms over something as seemingly, trite as that, think about when we're talking about these issues of, like, to what, is it okay to deny biological sex in certain circumstances and not in others when it comes to pronouns, bathrooms, sports, or changing of gender markers? Is it not okay to do that ever? And then, if there are in the gender critical space, that seems to be like the crux of the debate that's happening internally. Like, to what extent does society have to sort of engage in this type of fictional thinking, in affirming the idea that somebody is in any way, whether like legally or linguistically, a member of the opposite sex, right? So that's what the gender critical movement seems to be basically splitting over, among other questions. That seems to be like the sort of foundational question underpinning all of the internal debates within and between different, gender critical thinkers and content creators. Whereas the issue with trans ideology, and you see with the radical trans activists, is that, while gender critical is debating about, like, to what extent, if at all, do we deny biological sex for the purpose of social cohesion now that we have opened Pandora's box and trans identification is like a massive phenomenon in our society, trans ideology is saying there's no such thing as biological sex. So as you can imagine,
I just said it's black and white.
Yeah, it's
either there's biological sex or there's not, versus when does it matter? Like, it's a more black and white analysis on the trans activist side than it seems to be on the gender critical side.
Right, exactly.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's immediately what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's that's totally correct what you're saying. Not only is the trans ideology much more like, I think that what ended up happening with trans ideology is that because it is such an intolerant sort of pseudo-religion, it ends up basically alienating trans-identified people who then, find themselves allied more with different gender-critical populations, because the gender ideology in and of itself contains such fundamentally intolerant premises, and premises that are based on belief as opposed to on any kind of evidence, that the trans ideology, just because of its ideological tenets, fundamentally is stuck in a more concentrated intellectual space of intolerance.
Yeah.
Whereas on the gender critical side, you have a lot more of these nuanced debates, and the reason I bring this up is because another factor that got me down in the rabbit hole, and not just to stop at the compilation of woke TikToks videos where people are just making fun of trans-identified people and their haircuts and their mental instability and things that were fundamentally not interesting to me to watch. It's not that I didn't share those criticisms or those thoughts, but it's just that it was not intellectually interesting to me in any way to stay stuck in just watching hundreds of hours of like reaction to woke TikTok videos. What really did it for me was being launched into, via the rabbit hole, all of these internal gender critical debates, because it's a much more intellectually stimulating space to be in for somebody like me. And also, I think that the other reason I brought this whole difference in the scope of these debates is that it's going to be much easier for you, like when you're trying to figure out, like, okay, in the name of pluralism and in the name of, as you had said, like reaching out to people who have opposing viewpoints to you, in the name of trying to expand your intellectual horizons and engaging on this extremely fraught and controversial topic, like how does somebody proceed? Well, it's going to be pretty impossible to engage with these ideologues. Like, there are always limits to the type of pluralism, and I'm not saying this as a sort of moral statement, as in you shouldn't, or it's impossible from a moral perspective. I'm saying that it's very difficult to engage with somebody whose ideology is so non-evidenced in such a belief system that you're going to find, much more, I guess, I don't know exactly. You're going to find much more success trying to argue with somebody who's even slightly gender critical, as opposed
to gender critical
right,
thought,
or at least open to it. Yeah, like that's something that I definitely noticed, and I think it's it's important when you're engaging in argumentation about this topic to try to figure out like what the actual belief system of the person who you're arguing against like holds, because this trans ideology is a belief system. It's kind of like a belief in God, right? They believe in the gendered soul, or they believe in the gender identity, or the male brain and the female body, or vice versa. They're believing in something that's unproven, also just unprovable with the metrics that we have today. Similarly to the belief in a God or higher power. An atheist is never going to be able to convince a religious person not to believe in God, because those are just two fundamentally opposing frameworks, right?
Yeah.
But for example, like if you want to convince somebody to accept your ideas, what I've learned through doing a bunch of debate is that the best way to go about this is try to figure out, with a person who you're in a debate with, figure out like what's their moral framework, what are their moral values, how do they, like, what is their calculus for making moral decisions in the times where there are dilemmas. Like the trolley problem is a perfect example of this, right? Like, is somebody more of a utilitarian or a consequentialist? Try to figure out sort of what I guess moral weighing mechanism the person who you're engaged with believes, and then the way to know whether or not you should invest your time and energy into argumentation is if you think that you're capable of making your arguments sort of fit their pre-existing moral framework better than their current arguments fit their currently existing moral framework. That is the place that in my opinion, as somebody with a lot of experience in debate, that's where you should be investing your energy, and not just like trying to yell at a trans activist online.
No, I actually really do agree. I'm glad you shared that, because I think a big thing that we're missing out on is understanding priorities. Like, I think a lot of this, like, at the end of the day, both the gender ideologues and the gender criticals at least believe very deeply that they have an interest in protecting kids. Now, that interest in protecting kids and how it actually looks when it's being enacted is very different, right? But we're maybe thinking about priorities insofar that one side maybe prioritizes the short-term comfort, while the other side prioritizes the long-term comfort, or one side prioritizes perceived psychological well-being, while the other side prioritizes perceived physiological well-being. And I'm just throwing these out there. Like, I think there's a much more nuanced conversation to be had pertaining to this specific topic. But, I often find myself getting lost in the weeds because in the weeds about it, because we are taking this very intellectual problem and trying to break it down into a thing that can be solved in the real world, which, yes, the real world involves intellectual engagement, but it's not, it's more tangible than that. That's something I've actually learned a lot through interacting with Jewish communities. Like, we were talking about this It's Shavuot, right?
Shavuot, yeah.
Shavuot earlier this week, where there's an ideal of what we'd like, and there's a material of what can actually be done. And I think we're getting lost in this ideal rather than working with the material. And I always like to say, I keep one foot in the door of each world. You have to actually make things work. And that's why I also like to say that, like, mindfulness for me was like a gateway drug. Like the mindfulness of like, okay, I can have a bad emotion and I don't have to necessarily own that emotion as like how I'm gonna feel for the rest of the day or the rest of my life. Like that is an ideal. And so it worked for me until it didn't. Like there's only so much you can do with like, I shouldn't be feeling the way that I am, or it's okay that I'm feeling the way that I am, but like one day I'd like to feel more differently. You use that sort of leverage of not feeling so drowned out by your emotions to then do something with them. So yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah, that I think the way that you tied the previous discussion about argumentation into like the intellectualization of emotions, which is I think implicitly what you were getting at, is really important, because so far we started with the conversation of what was going on, what were the factors that went on that sort of catalyzed your detransition. We talked about trauma. And then instead of fully answering the question, and this is partially my fault, is that we went down the rabbit hole of gender critical ideas, endlessly intellectualizing in ways that I think are very important. But because you brought up connecting the sort of material world with the ideal world, in order to sort of, I guess, get out of our heads and maybe into our bodies for a second, like in the process of detransitioning, to what extent, I guess, consuming these ideas, or like for you, I guess, was your detransition, what would you say the role was of engaging in this type of argumentation, or at least being a spectator to these different arguments kicking around, have versus an underlying emotional catalyst? Because it seems like both were relevant in your story.
Oh, yeah, both were definitely relevant. I do think that because intellectualization got me into it, intellectualization played a big role in getting me out. Because I remember, like, in 7th grade, right, as I was getting into this ideology, I did my science fair project on gender roles, right? And I actually saw this, I was looking back at
we would have been such good friends.
We would have. That's what we are now, right?
I know.
But I was looking back at the Instagram of a little girl who was getting into the ideology alongside me, and she had made a post briefly before she came out as transgender, basically saying, like, love your body, it's the only one you've got. And so it's so interesting to me that, like, the intellectualization is a slippery slope. It really is. That itself is an intellectual concept, right? And that's what's so funny about it. But it really is, because, I mean, I think for me, the intellectualization got me into it. It kind of got me out to it. But the thing that kept me human throughout both things was my deep desire to make the world a better place. And at first I thought I was going to do that by creating space for myself as a transgender person and other people as transgender persons. But at the end of the day, what I realized was that in a way that was sort of enabling the harm that we were experiencing in the first place, that instead of actually truly breaking free of that cycle of forced upon gender roles and punishment for deviation from the gender roles, I was just contributing to them in a more palatable way, in a way that I felt was aligned with my true self and my true intellectualism and my true intellectual idea of what it meant to be a person. But I also have different priorities today than I did back then. And I think that that's kind of where the emotions intersect, is at the end of the day, like you said, like our belief systems are our belief systems. Like that's not something you can't convince someone out of atheism so easily. You can't convince them out of, theism so easily. Like it's something that comes down to a very deep dance with maybe what it means to be human, and that's not something we have fully unlocked either. So I don't know, but I do know that today I try and hold space for both things. Like I try and hold space for the intellectualism, because that's the ideal, that's how we get to a better world, but also for the humanity, because like people right now, like I'm not saying someone like Corinna Cohn, love Corey like so much, someone like Corey can't detransition in the same way that I could. So like, how are we going to protect space for that person? How are we going to protect space for Corey to be able to like move through life, while also advocating to have people like Corey have a different path through life, starting from when Corey first transitioned, so that way Corey doesn't have those issues now. Does that make sense? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other question of like the material versus the ideological, because there are a lot of people who will say, that passing transsexuals should not be using the facilities of the opposite sex to their biological sex, i.e. the gender that they're trying to perform. And I think that what a lot of people don't realize is that it's a purely ideological statement to try to get a passing trans woman or trans-identified male, whatever words you want me to use, to go into the men's bathroom. That's just not going to happen. Like, you can say, oh, but this person is a threat to women. Ultimately, it's that trans-identified person who's going to be walking into the bathroom, and your arguments are not going to convince them. So how do we navigate, this conflict, this fundamental conflict of rights, of trans rights, versus women's rights? And if you accept the idea that, actually, I would say that you don't even need to accept the idea that there is such a thing as like a transgender essence, or an essence that makes somebody transgender. Like, I think that being transgender is a series of actions rather than some kind of essence that can be, I think the essence is actually, the transgender essence is actually manufactured as like a post hoc rationalization of all of these medical and social interventions taken to appear as the opposite sex, and trying to sort of, it describes the experience of being of one biological sex, having any number of causes of distress, and then finding this specific pathway in hopes of overcoming that distress to varying extents. And so whether or not you believe in the idea, like, you could say trans people don't exist, or you could say that the trans women are literally women. Again, both of these are ideological statements. Like, the idea, the idea that a lot of gender criticals, I think, don't want to accept is that there are people who have transitioned, and there are a lot of people who have transitioned and are very gender critical, and I see a lot of calls for gender critical, transitioned people to detransition so they can be role models for young girls and young guys.
Needs to be a role
model. Not only that, but also it's a little bit, it's kind of a ridiculous ask to make of somebody, because at some point, like, everybody, people who go into transition don't go into it because they want to deceive everybody around them.
Many don't.
Yeah, many don't. Some, I'm sure, do, but many of them don't. And they're getting into it because they were promised, that this would be the cure for their distress. They realize that it hasn't. They may even have regrets about it, right?
So many do, and just don't talk about it because they're afraid of being weaponized.
Right. And
so many do.
And also, the psychological concept of regret is one which psychologists are still trying to study, because, for example, there are people who, like, I've heard from a lot of women who used to be in abusive marriages, like, oh, like, my husband, he was beating on me every day, but at least I got my kids out of it, right? Like, regret is such a catastrophic psychological state for somebody to be in, that most people will try to shove away any possible dissonance in order to avoid coming to a position in life or a place in life where they actually regret something and admit it to themselves. It takes a certain amount of psychological resilience and an ability to logically cope with dissonance in order to say, or in order to feel like, I regret this, instead of trying to endlessly rationalize it away. And the reason I bring this up is that, detransitioners, right? There's this one narrative that everybody expects all of us to have, which is one of pure regret. And I think that, and similarly, like, I guess the issue of regret seems to be weaponized in these discussions, because there will be some trans-identified people who will say, like, oh, I don't regret this, even though these procedures almost killed me. I don't regret this. And then other, people in that same thought process saying, oh, well, this is evidence that, these treatments are good for some people and not for others. Like, medically speaking, these are risky treatments. There is no evidence. There's no evidence to show that it is beneficial to anybody in any measurable way.
In any objective, measurable way.
Yeah, in any, yeah.
Well, and I think to add to that too, I often conceptualize regret as a sort of like net calculation, where it's like when in that instance that you gave as an example, like it was awful because that person was getting beat on, but then there's the, like, if that's like a negative number, then you have the positive number of getting the kids out of the situation. So it might not be a totally regretful thing, because at the end of the day, it comes out to a net better, even if there was this awful, terrible bad that contributed to that calculation.
Right.
So it's kind of like -7 plus 9, right? It's to +2.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like the calculus of like...
The calculus is a good way to put it.
Yeah,
I heard you say that earlier.
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorite words. The calculus that people go through when they're, intellectualizing their life is very different from the decision. It precipitates often decision making. But as far as like the actual jumping into, okay, what do I do with this now? Like you have Scott Nugent, right? How is Scott going to detransition? That's why Scott has created like a YouTube channel or a network called Trans Regretters. Like I think that there's this expectation that the opposite of trans is detrans, but I don't think that that's a helpful way in looking at this at all, because what we're dealing with are people who are distressed and either on the precipice of being medicalized or have been medicalized for some period of time, or who have been medicalized for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And to what extent regret plays a role in any of it, ultimately you have a bunch of people who are coping as best as they can with the information they have. And then, so where does society go from there? Like we have to have, instead of having ideological conversations about, trans women are women or trans women are men, or, trans rights are human rights, or like any of these ideological tagline types of discussions, we need to start talking more about these intricacies, with the spaces, like having a third option.
Well, and I think too that part of that comes down to the language you use, and this is something you and I have spoken about previously, like the whole terminology of detrans versus desisted, right? Because when I first, quote unquote, detransition, when I first stopped identifying as trans in an ideological sense, I was very conflicted, because I was like, I'm not doing anything for my detransition. Like I'm not putting effort to be more womanly. I'm just, no longer caring to correct people's use of female terminology for me. So it was more like I just stopped doing stuff rather than did something to actually go the opposite way. And so I used the word desisted. And many people were like, that's not how that word's used. That word's reserved for people who didn't fuck up as bad as you did. And I was like, okay, well. And so now I generally just use detrans. I don't get caught up too much in the label game, because honestly, labels don't matter to me that much. But I do think it's interesting to conceptualize people like that who physically cannot detransition. They can't do anything. They can't even stop the things that I was able to stop, but rather have ideologically desisted, have stopped believing in this thing as trans. And that was one thing I actually wanted to comment on from what you were saying previously, was the essence of trans, the trans essence. To me, an alternative definition for that is purchase into the gender ideology. That trans essence is an identifiable thing. It is someone's belief that one can be trans truly. Because I have people who haven't even medicalized who say that they're more trans than me, and I'm like, okay, tell that to my flat chest. Like, I will, and that's something too, is like, as much as I've quote unquote detransitioned, I will always be materially trans. Like, I will have a body that is different from the norm of female because of my participation in gender ideology. I'm still going to be perceived as a woman who has a surgically flattened chest, who has a testosteronized body, and that's something that gives me that experience that someone even who identifies as non-binary but will never medicalize won't have. So it's a much more complex topic than just someone being again, it's not a black and white thing. But how do you feel about that language, about that use of detrans versus desisted, as someone who maybe many would conceptualize as a desister? How does that make you feel?
So I would say that like, when I think about these three terms, detransitioner, desister, and regretter, I think that we're only talking about publicly, the sort of public language in this political culture war. The only word that is used is detransitioner. So in a lot of videos that I do, I'll describe myself as a detransitioner because that's how somebody who's looking through their YouTube, they'll see this word and they'll know the type of experience that I'm having, and then you'll have some right, and then you'll have some trans activists come into the comments but be like, oh, but you weren't really trans because you didn't transition, so how can you be a detransitioner? And it's like, well, first of all, you guys considered me trans before I medicalized, simply because of how well I passed, right? Simply because of the way in which I was able to, because of my sort of naturally more masculine tendencies, or maybe my androgynous voice, or whatever it is, or just living in the ethnic features, right? Just living in the Middle East, or whatever it is. Right? So clearly that's an example of a moving target, which is another logical fallacy.
Well, and it moves too for people like me who did transition, and they still say that I was never trans.
Right.
So it's not even just a matter of whether or not you've transitioned. We see it as sort of that action, the being trans is the action of transitioning, whereas others see it again as that purchase into the ideology.
Right, exactly. And so that's why I think that, like, desistance, detransition, and regretting, these are basically three flavors of a very similar, spectrum of experiences. Like they're basically 3 points.
It's like Mr.
along
Pibb,
a spectrum.
Coke. It's like Mr. Pibb, Coke, and Pepsi. Like
right,
they're all
exactly.
very similar. They're all Coke.
Right, exactly. Like they're all sugary, brown, carbonated beverages that you can purchase in a can. And if you shake the can up, it explodes when you open it.
Yeah.
It's
they're soda.
They're soda, exactly. Like they're descriptively referring to, very similar phenomena. And
sorry, I got a picture of pant leg.
Okay. So, yeah, like I think that they're 3 very similar nodes along a spectrum. I do think that desistance. When I conceptualize desistance, I know that everybody wants me to call myself a desister as opposed to a detransitioner.
It doesn't matter.
Although, I'm a little bit, like, I just want people to understand what I'm talking about whenever I use any of these terms.
That's
I don't
what
care.
language is for.
Right, that's why I speak 4 languages, is because I want to be, like, incredibly precise in ways that in one language you can't be, and in another language you can be, but that other language then lacks a certain sort of cultural context or like kind of schematic context, in order to be able to, like, I guess, categorize this other type of human experience. That's why it's, like, cool to speak multiple languages.
Totally.
And anyways, to answer the question that you asked instead of the questions that I wanted to answer.
Oh, wow. We already talked about that, didn't we?
Whoopsie. I think that when I think about desistance at its core, I think that desistance actually ought to refer to the divestment from ideological thinking.
I agree.
Because if you think of what desist means, like cease and desist, it means to stop. Right?
That was my thinking, yeah.
It means to, like, when you think cease and desist, it's like, ooh, that's like a hard line. Like, they don't want any contact with me anymore. Like, I'm going to stop bothering them. Like, when I feel like I desisted from the ideology, the way I conceptualized it was like, I am going to divest myself from any thought that I should have been born male, like in any capacity, right? The detransition process for me was actually, like, not binding anymore, like, not squashing my breasts and not focusing so much on, like, looking at myself in the mirror and trying to figure out if I can dress in a way that makes my shoulders look, at about the same width as my hips. Like, I wasn't doing all of these little trans brain tricks.
Calculus.
All of this constant, like, everyday rumination in order to pass as male. Like, for me, that was the detransition, was introducing myself as Maya, and especially, like, in Arabic and Hebrew, speaking about myself in the feminine. That's when I feel like the process, like, that something actually shifted in the way I was living my life, because instead of going to the men's side of the Western Wall, I at some point, I kind of desisted shortly after October 7th, so I didn't have a lot of time to test this, out in Israel per se, although I did test out this aspect of detransition in one context, which was in the university, because all of my legal documents were not complying with the legal fiction that I believed myself to be male.
Mine do.
Whoops.
We
all have our little developmental...
Our little oopsies.
Oopsies, yeah.
And have you ever heard of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
No.
So it's this idea that the language we use both shapes and reflects how we interact with the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
It's why different languages speak about time differently. Like the French say that time marches. A lot of Southern Asian cultures say that time passes. Yet we say that time runs and time flies here in the United States. And it sort of reflects the way that the culture, like the pace of the culture specifically, like how people think about it. And so I think that it sounds like your experience was very similar to mine in that regard, in our ideological desistance, that it was more this thing where it's like we started treating the term womanhood differently in ourselves, and then it became less, like it changed how we then acted in the world as women. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, 100%. And like the ideological desistance brought about for me the detransition, even though my transition wasn't medical, like thank God, there is still, like, I think that there's a lot of sort of people wanting to draw a very strong line ideologically, even within gender critical, instead of looking at, like, what are the needs of these specific populations of people and patients. Like, a lot of times, desistance is described as the process of, either, like, basically, like, yeah, I guess, identifying as trans, and then not identifying as trans, but having had no medical element involved in that process, versus detransition, which is both desisting ideologically and desisting, physically,
Like
and medically.
Yeah.
And I think that this is like a flawed dichotomy, because there are a lot of people who detransition who are still ideologically aligned.
I agree.
With gender ideology. They just think, oh, I'm not trans, right? Like, this didn't work for me, but, there are people who it works for. And, like, the reason that I have a problem with people making statements like, oh, there are people for whom this works, is that it's a statement that doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're not defining what does it mean for an intervention to work for somebody, especially when you're making such a statement that requires, evidence. Like, you have to uphold the null hypothesis. I think that this whole discussion has done away with the null hypothesis in its entirety. And so instead of somebody having to prove in a scientific or in a quantitative and observable way that X intervention brings about Y positive outcome, we're just supposed to accept that, oh, X intervention didn't work for me, but it'll generate Y positive outcome for this other person based on which metrics and which evidence we don't know. Like, you can't just make statements like that without backing them up.
And especially without thinking, why didn't that intervention work for me? Like, I think that's the important piece. And I love your correlation to the null hypothesis with that, because I really do think that brings us back to the scientific roots, and where certain ideological arguments have strayed away from the science. I sort of took what you were saying and I drew a little picture as like a Venn diagram, where it's almost like you can be desisted, detransitioned, and regretful. You can be desisted and regretful, but not detransitioned. You can have this combination of these characteristics, because they're not actually so mutually exclusive as they're marketed.
They're
to
not
be.
Discrete categories in my mind. Like, so
That's
I think
also a very fluid way to view language, which is totally what I expect from someone who speaks for. So
yeah, I just think that if we're talking about, like, I would also consider myself to be a detransitioner, because, like, the difference between somebody like me and somebody like you, it's like, you had a mastectomy. It's not like you can get your breasts back, right? Would it make you less of a detransitioner or more of a detransitioner to get another intervention, which would be another cosmetic procedure to reconstruct your breasts? Or does detransition just mean stopping the process of transition? And does that have anything to do with ideology? Because for some people it does, and for some people it's literally just that they had a bunch of health problems on testosterone, but they still think that people of any age who believe that they are a member of the opposite sex should be given treatments to, modify their sexual characteristics. So it's like, these are independent things here.
And also for me, like, I didn't have to do anything to get to where I am today. Like, I'm wearing the same outfits that I wore prior to stopping the medical interventions. I literally haven't cut my hair since I detransitioned.
Oh, wow.
And so, that's the thing for me, is like, I literally have just stopped doing these things to control my appearance and others' perceptions of me. I haven't actually done anything. Growing out my hair, which is perhaps the most, stereotypically feminine thing about me. It isn't actually something I've had to do. It just happens. All of what is me today just is how I naturally am. No drugs needed. And that's a beautiful thing. But I would say for you too, even stopping binding is ceasing a medical intervention.
Oh yeah.
I mean, binding does physiologically change your body, regardless of whether or not people say it's safe. It's not always safe, and I would reckon that it actually is never truly safe, because that's a part of your body that isn't supposed to be bound in that way.
Right. Exactly, like binding and tucking are physical interventions
on growing body parts.
Yeah, exactly. Like they are interventions and constraints that you place around your physical body in a way which sort of reifies the fact, or rather the falsity that there's something wrong with your body, that your body is somehow incompatible with who you are. And when you stop any of those interventions, and you stop, like for me, I was very masculine presenting even when I was trans identified, and I'm still very masculine presenting now. I've let my hair, grow out a little bit more, but I still go to barbershops because I like men's haircuts, and I like vests and bow ties. Like that to me, that's not what detransition means to me per se. And I think that conception of somebody going from trans to a very gender conforming member of their sex, and that is like the ideal detransition, that is also that is what stopped me from disembarking from the trans journey for years after I'd encountered the concept of detransitioners, is because I thought, well, if this is what it is to be a woman, have long hair and wear women's clothes, I don't want to do that. I'm going to stay transitioned. So there's a lot that's wrong with these types of discrete categories around who, whether somebody's a desister or a detransitioner or a regretter. I think we need to see it in somewhat of a more modular way, like we've all talked about, in regards to just what needs does this specific person have? What experience are they going through? And potentially, what are the medical needs of somebody who's undergone a mastectomy, or who has overcome or undergone, for example, the genital surgeries done on female genitals, the different subtypes of that, the different subtypes of male genital surgeries for the purposes of sex reassignment. We need to start thinking about it instead of one overwhelming experience where there's desisters who are dealing only with psychological upheaval, and detransitioners who are dealing both with medical consequences and psychological consequences.
Sorry about that. That was Ether, another detransitioner, and also my girlfriend. You might see her in the next video.
Yeah, here's to hoping.
Here's to hoping. But I actually really think that distinction, the revision of that distinction, matters. And I would propose that maybe we speak about it in terms of, rather than medical versus non-medical interventions, high-tech versus low-tech interventions. Because I feel like that's one way we could conceptualize it and recognize that those whom we consider desisters, in the current terminology, they are undergoing medical interventions too, just in a different way. Because binding the breasts to make them appear smaller, or even just to have them appear smaller temporarily, will ultimately make them appear smaller in the long term as well. So that's
not just smaller, but more flat
and deformed, and but that itself is a low-tech intervention versus the high-tech intervention of shots or surgeries. So food for thought.
Wow, that's genius. I think that's I've never thought about it in those terms, but I think that's a brilliant way of conceptualizing it, because the high-tech interventions are more drastically permanent in the side effects that they leave. Because they're more invasive, you can see and feel and experience the scars and the alterations done to your body as a result of that in a much more, I guess, visual way. Whereas with something like binding or tucking of the male genitals, those can obviously cause pretty drastic consequences that also leave a lifetime of memory in your body, but they just didn't require a doctor to sign off on them. Instead, you got your information off of these, internet forums where people acted as if these interventions were a good way to manage distress, when in my experience, the social transition primes you to entrench your distress even further and drives you even closer and closer into a medical transition in order to keep up the perceived progress of being perceived as the opposite sex that your social transition gives you, and taking it that step further and entrenching it that step further into your body. And so I think that it's impossible to separate these experiences as two discrete experiences, when in my experience, the social transition, while it made me feel as if my distress was being solved, and that actually the fact that I felt that I lived such a rich and amazing and high-functioning life as a man was evidence of the fact that I should take this even further and use testosterone and have my breasts removed and more of those high-tech procedures. It's like low-tech interventions tend to put someone on a pathway, or at least heavily predispose them towards a pathway of engaging in high-tech intervention. So I think that's like a really brilliant way of putting it.
Thank you.
So I guess the next question, well, I have a couple more questions before we wrap up, but one of the questions I have really is that, speaking from my own experience, I've learned a lot about not only myself, but about so many different aspects of like society, different societies, sex-based roles, how men and women operate, and about myself as well, and myself as somebody who is still sort of in the last, I guess, stint of psychological development. There have been many lessons I've learned over the course of detransitioning, and I would like to ask you, like, what are some key things that you've learned either about yourself or the world, or just like from the process of transition? Like, what has transition or detransition taught you?
It's taught me a lot of things. I've definitely learned a lot. It's matured me a lot. The detransition side of things, especially, it has taught me to listen to my gut, and to listen to my gut critically, not just at face value. Like when it came to my complications with my mastectomy, listening to my gut very possibly saved my life. And the way I differentiate that from listening to my gut in the case of dysphoria is the context being important. Being grounded in your surroundings and in your body will help you distinguish whether or not that gut feeling of your body being wrong is different, and that gut feeling of, like, the body being wrong in the sense of, like, my sex is different from my body being wrong in the sense of my, breasts necrotizing. But I think aside from that, I've also learned the significance and insignificance of language. Like, language is both an art and a science. Learning that there is so much you can convey with words, that words are fluid, yet words mean something. I've learned that sex is real. Like, even between when I first detransitioned and now, like, at the time, I was like, there's no differences between men and women. Like, men and women are exactly the same, and society tells us that they're different. And I'm like, no, like, men and women are different. Like, that's okay. We're designed to be different evolutionarily. Like, that is how life is born into this world, is by men and women to being different. But learning again, and this is a concept we've touched on several times throughout this discussion, is, when do things matter and when don't they matter, and understanding that all things work in that regard. Like, if I really want an energy drink, like, when's a day that I can have the extra energy and stay up to 4 a.m. and when's a day when I need to go to bed at 8, like, it really, life is a give and a take. It's a utilitarian decision. That's a phrase that, during your time here with me, like, you've really loved to use, and I've loved hearing it used, and I've loved using it myself, because that's how life works in my perspective, and emphasis on my perspective, because others may feel differently. But at the end of the day, like, this has taught me that there is bad in the world, period, but also that there is good, and that it's up to you to kind of decipher the good and the bad in each situation you encounter.
Wow. I think those are all extremely prudent lessons, and to briefly touch upon one of the seemingly, like, less bombastic ones, or maybe it's the most bombastic one, depending on what perspective you're coming from. Obviously, this perspective of, coming to the perspective that men and women are different seems to most people who have never had a quote-unquote gender journey, or who have never, gone down the pathway of like questioning their gender or their sex, or if their body is right or wrong, or all of these other things.
Such a funny phrase.
It's like from an epistemic and even more fundamentally from like an ontological perspective, it doesn't actually make a ton of sense, like from either of those sort of philosophical perspectives. But if you've never gone down the type of set of life experiences that people like us have gone down, it'll seem like a really idiotic statement that the phrase, being able to utter the phrase men and women are different, is some kind of revelation. Like, it's one of those fundamental things that you think, okay, every like 4 or 5 year old knows that men and women are different. But fundamentally, this is what this entire thing comes down to, is that not only are men and women different from each other, but that actually internally within the category of man, which is a category of both age and biology, and within the category of women, which is a category defined by both age and biology, that individuals within these categories that are, internally grouped by both age and biology, that you can have so much diversity within those, and the only like similarities within each of the categories of man or woman is simply, again, age and biology. Like, there is such a and also that femininity or masculinity, like, these are kind of descriptions of the roles that I think a lot of this discussion about gender, the way that it was in its earliest days, when I got into trans ideology, when it was in its infancy, the arguments were framed as, you have your gender, which is your tendency to wear specific clothes, groom your hair a specific way, and maybe act or speak in a specific way.
The norms.
Right. The social norms that are in some ways totally arbitrary when corresponded to somebody's sex, but in other ways have roots in like overwhelming group tendencies based on biological functions. And for me, something that I've realized really within the last few days is like, because of my masculinity, and I mean, not only the fact that I love women, but also the way in which I tend to be in relationships with women, and the way that, like, because of these, I guess, autistic traits that everybody in the comments section says that I have, I tend to relate a lot better to men, because women's emotions and the ways in which they can seemingly shift on a dime when I feel like I've said nothing wrong, the way that women can, like the women I've dated, can get just so incredibly pissed off at me for it. Like giving, like if I give a woman a compliment about, her, how nice she looks in her dress, and she'll say, oh, are you saying that my hair is not nice? And it's like, no, I didn't say that. I don't know where you got that from. Like, these little anecdotes of the ways that I've related to women in the past, like, that is precisely when I was trans-identified and complaining about women I was dating to my male friends, and most of my friends were men. They would relate to me on that, and I would relate to them when they were complaining about these similar things with their girlfriends. But yet, and I thought, well, this is evidence for the fact that I have a male brain. But now the way that I conceptualize it really is that, I start to think not only about the similarities that I've had with these men, but also the differences that I've had in the way that they discuss, like the way that they view women, like from like a sexual perspective, and the ways in which a lot of the heterosexual men that I've talked with don't have any interest really in like reciprocating pleasurable sexual interactions for their female partners. Like, they don't care about the pleasure of their partner for a lot of these men I've interacted with who are admittedly in their 20s. And that I've heard is something that happens with time, is that men tend to learn to value, the reciprocal nature of an intimate interaction like that. But anyways, like, I never had a thought go through my mind, where my partner's pleasure didn't matter to me. And so what this kind of duality points to is that it's a long-winded way of saying that, like, female masculinity and male masculinity are very different from each other, similarly to how female femininity and male femininity are different to each other.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that kind of goes back to a definition of femininity and masculinity that I heard recently, in that it's not that femininity, quote unquote, is exclusive to the female sex, or that it even stems from the tendencies of the female sex, but rather that it stems from the expectations of the female sex. And so it is more of what women are going to be judged for if they do not do, or, you know, in the case of masculinity, what men are going to be judged for if they do not do, rather than these things that are inherent to men and women. You're right, it's a very different thing being masculine as a male versus being feminine as a woman, you know. They're very different things because it's a different set of expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, I mean, we could obviously talk about this forever. Oh, did you want to add something?
Well, no, I guess to transition to what I thought you were going to transition to moving forward, right? Is I think that maybe something that I would give as a piece of advice to that regard, but also to the conversation we just had, is that yes, it's good to have a culture. It's good to acknowledge that the culture exists, and it's good to value the culture because it gives us a table to dine at, right? That while these things are important, it is equally important to tolerate when someone deviates from that norm, to appreciate the diversity from that norm, to appreciate what that deviation from that norm adds to the norm, how it reinforces the value of the norm and therefore reinforces the value of that person. That if you have this female norm, then you have someone like Maya, that is such a beautiful thing to have, as someone who, like, a woman who wears fucking vests and has cute curly hair, you know what I mean? Like, it's a good thing to have deviation from the norm, is what I'm saying. And so, you know, appreciating that as much as you appreciate the norm is something I think we should really take with us into the future.
I think that you've said that in a very eloquent way.
Sorry, I have to take away your transition.
No, maybe you did, but it's okay.
It's okay. You took away your own transition, Maya.
Ooh, oh,
Ooh.
Well, I've got to say that maybe I'm biased because of that lovely compliment that you gave me, but I think that the way you put that really gets at the essence of why so many of these kids are distressed. So many of these kids and, you know, vulnerable young adults are distressed, and where that confusion is. The confusion, when people, especially when right-wing commentators talk about gender confusion, I think that what a lot of these right-wing commentators are talking about is really just gender nonconformity, that they are pathologizing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But the way that you're talking about gender confusion is about confusing your, the extent to which you may deviate from expectations around members, around what is expected from you as a member of your sex category with, some very kind of esoteric idea that is based in ideology that somehow your body needs to be sort of surgically and chemically and visually approximated in order to align more with the sex that you are not. Like, that's what you're describing as the root of the confusion. And I think it's an extremely apt description, because a lot of people use the term gender confused to mean a little boy who wants to wear dresses, when maybe that little boy is not confused and doesn't have a complex about it until you give him a complex about it.
Yeah. Well, and even and liberal parents are guilty of that just as much as conservative ones, because you might think you're being all noble telling your little boy, yeah, it's okay to wear girls' clothes, but you're still reinforcing that idea of that child doing something wrong by calling it girls' clothes. Like, I remember hearing this story of this parent whose little boy was wearing a dress and doing all these twirls and tumbles, and stops to ask mom, like, can I wear girls' clothes to school next year? And the mom, instead of clarifying the language, asking, do you mean dresses? Like, do you want to wear dresses to school next year? Like, sure, whatever. She goes, oh, do you feel like a girl? And makes it this big, again, esoteric thing that it didn't have to be. That little boy was perfectly fine with his own deviation from the norm, but he lacked the precision of language to ask for it as dresses instead of girls' clothes. And then it becomes this whole philosophical issue that we've now put onto that child, that if that hadn't been put onto that child at that age, very well might have been put onto that child at age 12 or 13 by virtue of going to school in the dresses and getting made fun of. Like, I do think it's important to talk to kids about being different. Don't convince them they're not different. Acknowledge the difference, but acknowledge the difference is a good thing. Like, I think there's a big difference. Again, difference, right? A big difference in those two things, like pathologizing it, but from a noble perspective, and genuinely being tolerant and teaching your kid that it's different but okay.
And also, to add to this, Because I know that when we talk about, little girls wearing boys' clothes, it's a different discussion than little boys wearing skirts and dresses. And I don't see a lot of people addressing this. They'll say, like, men should never wear women's clothes in public. Maybe little boys can, or maybe they totally can't. But when we're talking about, like, practically what does a parent do in that situation, in my opinion, like, the consequences on little boys for wearing skirts and dresses and feminine articles of clothing is definitely a higher social cost than it is on little girls. And we're talking about pre-puberty. Post-puberty, the consequences become very similar because a lot of girls are expected to, feminize their appearance around puberty. So being a tomboy is acceptable up to a certain point. But the point I'm trying to make here is, like, if you have a kid, whether it's a little boy who likes to wear skirts and dresses and will die on that hill and likes to paint his nails and play around with sparkles and again will die on that hill, not just somebody who does it because his sisters dress him up, but I'm talking about, like, if this seems to be the essence of of your child's, like, self-expression, this gender nonconforming, if this seems to be the nature of the way your child's trajectory tends to go, like, you either by, like, forbidding your kid from doing it, like, that can push them into trans in the way that my gender nonconformity was pathologized and that pushed me into trans, like, that's like the way in which we always hear about these pre-gay kids. The factors that make them have this disunity between their body and their perception of their sex body, and the rightness or wrongness of it. And so you can't really do that. Like, you shouldn't pathologize nonconformity, but you also can't pretend as if nonconformity is totally socially acceptable. And in my mind, you have to like in a similar way to, like, if you had a kid who is diagnosed with autism, right? You don't have to go out and say, oh, you're autistic, which means X, Y, and Z things, but what you need to prepare your child for the fact, that you don't even have to put a label on them, but you do have to prepare them for the fact that these traits, which are the reason why they have this specific label, right, of gender nonconforming or sissy boy or tomboy or whatever, or even autistic, right? You need to prepare them for, like, X, Y, and Z traits will be perceived in X, Y, and Z ways. And, this, like, you can't expect that everybody is as accepting as mommy and daddy are. But at the end of the day, in our family, we don't believe that little boys can't wear dresses.
Yeah, you have to prepare your kids for a world that's going to be mean. You have to build them to be resilient. And that's a huge, huge takeaway that I think we can apply to all areas of life, is teach your kids to have realistic expectations about the world. Teach them how to make, again, a utilitarian decision. If you want to wear the dresses, but know that people might not be friendly about it. And if you really want to wear the dresses, you're going to have to be okay with that. And often you wearing the dresses can be the driving force that helps them to be okay with you in the inverse. So
exactly. Yeah. Well, on that note, while we could talk forever, I would like to, say a huge thank you to Soren for coming on for another hour plus of this discussion, and for hosting me in her home. It's been a real pleasure. And very clearly, I'm sitting with somebody who is highly intelligent, who has a lot of experience.
Same here.
And if you would like for me to, include your social media in the description, you should check the description of this video, and you'll be able to find Soren on the interwebs, where she hangs out when she isn't doing all kinds of, extremely important and impactful and insightful work. And I would like to thank you all also for listening. And I guess you'll catch me at our next episode, which will be at some undetermined date. But see you then. Do you have anything final?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, guys. Have a great day. Bye.